Okay, good evening. Parashat Shmos, a lot to learn, a lot of lessons come out of it, some more obvious than the others, some very deep. It's amazing. You don't really realize this until after you discover deeper things, deeper messages, deeper explanations, how much we take for granted that that's just the way it was. The pshat, the simple explanation, that's just, what happened. And there's not much more to it. And ostensibly the story itself is just about the Jewish people who were enslaved, as God predicted would be the case, and the Egyptians took advantage of them and worked them very hard and built Pitim and Ramses and the pyramids and whatever else that the Jewish people were involved with. And this went on for about 116 years altogether. And then God sent Moshe, and he came down and was a savior, did miracles to save the Jewish people in the 10 plagues. And we went out, and thank God that we did. And we celebrate that once a year on Pesach. Really, we mention it every, twice a day in the Shema, but in other places too. It's all part of our daily routine. But the main place, of course, is by the Haggadah, because that's where we really focus in the story to try to understand what difference it made to our future, our lives. As the Haggadah says, that we have to look at ourselves as if we too left Mitzrayim, because had we not gone out, then there'd be no Jewish people. We'd still be here. I mean, people would be here, but there would be no Jewish people per se, or maybe they would. Maybe God would start someplace else. But that's what we're told. That's the party line, so to speak, that we are sold and we go with, and we assume it's the way it is. And we leave it at that. And of course, the problem with that is elsewhere in the Chumash it says, that you have to remember history, to learn history and look at the patterns and look at what happened in the past, specifically, to learn about how to deal with the future, or at least the present, the future that becomes the present in your lifetime, like today. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to respond? We're gambling once again. The Jewish people, we've spoken about this so many different times already, but here we are once again confronting the world. It expanded, right? First in the beginning, which is one nation. It was a big nation, huge nation, a mighty nation, but the Jewish people were all in one place, in one, not necessarily all in Goshen still, but we were in one country, and we had to deal with one country. And then over the course of a couple of thousand years, we spread out, thanks to the Romans, who came in, and the Greek exile was homegrown. It was right near Israel. We didn't have to go anywhere. It was more of a spiritual exile. But the Romans came in and they took us out. They basically took Jews and went all across Asia and Europe, and eventually, we're in England. And before Christopher Columbus went to discover America, we were only in this continent, but we were spread out across Europe. And so when Hitler, Yimach V'zichro, he rose to power, he was dealing with the Jewish population. It was one continent, but not one nation anymore. And now here we are in the future. We're all around the world, right? Even though it was many years after discovering America, but really the Holocaust pushed Jews literally to the four corners of the earth, as or the four, whatever they are, because we don't have corners. But we know what it means. That we're all over the place. You name it. It's amazing. There's jokes about this, how such a tiny country with such small population could actually have so many people living in so many different places around the world. And the prophecy made back in Moshe's time, which is absolutely remarkable. Who promises things like this? There's just so much that has to happen in between that you could not predict unless you were God and you knew what was going to happen, because you're going to make it happen. But God said there'll come a time at the end of history where I will go, and you can just imagine in the midbar when they learned this the first time, and God says, if you're at the four corners of the world, I'm going to come get you. And the Jews are going, what does it even mean? Until now we've known Canaan, Mitzrayim, maybe Mesopotamia, Babylonia, but we didn't know about America per se at that time, or North America. So the idea of the four corners of the earth, how do you understand that? It's like God telling Moshe Rabbeinu, and by the way, in the future when they make light bulbs, tell them they shouldn't turn them on Shabbos. Okay, I'll write that down. What's a light bulb? How does it work? But it was there in the prophecy, and here we are, thousands of years later. Remarkably, here we are, actually dealing with that prophecy, being actually a part of that prophecy, coming true in our time. And they're going back in his time already in the 1700s, and his Talmidim in the early 1800s began the process, but it's very small. And most probably were betting against it, that it wouldn't work, that it wouldn't survive. And it was very harsh, very difficult. It was not for the fact they were so devoted to making it happen, because their Rebbe, the Gra, said this is part of Kibbutz Galius, and the time frame supported that because it was already after 5500, which was halfway through the sixth millennium, which according to the Zohar is like morning, right? Because you take a millennium and you divide it, it's like a day. One millennium is one day for Hashem, so to speak, Kivyocho. So that we have this proportion, this relationship where we take a day and we look at the first 500 years as if it's the night, and then the next 500 years like it's the day. So therefore, in 5500, which is 1740, the Gra was 20 years of age. He said the Zohar says this is when we start preparing for Shabbos. Just like you do every Shabbos. Every Shabbos is from Chatzot onward. You're supposed to think Shabbos. Even from the morning, you're supposed to already be working on it. But certainly from Chatzot after onward, the mentality is Shabbos is coming, and you're supposed to leave work early if you can, and prepare for Shabbos. Because as the Gemara says, if you don't prepare for Shabbos, what will you eat on Shabbos itself? And that's a metaphor for all of life. But he saw this, and he took it seriously. It took a while, but amazingly, there were waves of Aliyah in the meantime, and it's been building. Here we are. It's absolutely mind-boggling and mind-blowing when you think about it and you appreciate it. But the trouble is we don't, because we go with the flow. And it's like the same way, how old are you? You're 45 years of age. You don't remember what it was like to be 20. Sometimes maybe when your body hurts a bit and you look at some old pictures, but even then it's like, yeah, I was once 20 at that time, but you because you grow old with yourself. If you went in a time capsule at the age of 20 and jumped to 45, you'd feel the difference. You'd notice the difference. You wouldn't recognize yourself. But we don't do that. Instead, we go from day to day to day, and we change. You look in the mirror every single day, and every day you see the change. But they're so small, they're so minute, you don't pay attention to them. So that it's you don't realize like 25, 30, 40, 50, 60 years have passed because you're used to yourself. And the same thing is true of history. We grow old with history. Every year, another thing happens, but you have to always go back and think to yourself, what was it like in 1990? What was it like in 2000? What was it like before the Twin Towers were attacked? Right? It was a completely different world. Like try and go back and think. When I was I'm from Toronto, and I was in Eretz Israel for quite a long time, and then we went back to Toronto for a couple of years in between before coming back, finally for good, Baruch Hashem. And we actually ended up living in the same area that I used to go to Cheder. And I remember like the street was pretty much the same. I mean, there obviously were changes and stories that come and gone, but the basic structure of the area was the same. And I could part of me recognized it from my childhood, so to speak. As I recognize it completely, but there was a part of me that tried to go back and see it the way I looked at it when I was that age. And I would sit there like literally in the car staring at my cheder, the shul that I went to cheder at, and tried to imagine that, and that didn't change much at all. It was the same building. I'm trying to imagine how that looked to me when I was a teenager or younger. And you can't. It's very hard. I mean, there was a couple of times, fleeting moments when I was able to like hook into that and almost have, but momentarily, I could not go back because you change, and everything changes with you. And because of that, you adapt, and years later to go back, even when you meet somebody from your childhood, it's not the same. It's not the same. You try, but it's not the same. You go back to a place, that you had a good job, and you took you was a hiatus for a while, and then you come back and try and pick up where you left off. And it's just not the same because history is always changing. Things are always changing. So the Haggadah tries to make it that we don't do that so much, that we don't become so detached from the reality that we lose perspective and forget what it means to us now, in the here and now, from day to day to day to day. So that when you open the Chumash and you're reading Parashat Shmos, as we will this Shabbos, B'ezras Hashem, that you understand that it's like it's current. It's not from 3,338 years ago. It's current. It's really the reality today. How is that possible? We're not in Mitzrayim anymore. We've left. We're living in modern day society. Egypt still exists, but it's not the Egypt of Moshe's time. And yeah, well, there are some common issues that we have to deal with today that we had to deal with back then. But other than that, it's like really completely different. Or is it? The Arizal brings down in Sharhat Gilgulim, a really remarkable concept, an idea that's very, very profound and important to understand. He says the following thing. The pasuk, the pasuk in I believe it's Nitzavim. Either I think it's or either Nitzavim or Yelech. They usually go together. But in the Moshe, God's telling Moshe Rabbeinu he's going to die. He knows it. It's coming up. It's just a question of really it's the same day. But he's giving Moshe a sneak preview of what's going to happen after he dies. He says, "You're going to die. You're going to lie with your fathers." Meaning, and there's all kinds of connotations of that as well. Meaning that he will die peacefully and righteously, But you will, after you're gone, this nation will, it says, become ha'am. This nation will get up. They'll rise up and go after the ways of the people of Canaan. That's what the pasuk says, and that's the way we read it. That's the way it's translated in the Chumash. The Gemara in Yuma says there are 5 pasukim, 5 verses. We're not sure exactly what they mean. You know why? Because the wording is ambiguous. How is it ambiguous in this pasuk? Because you can read the word vakam, which is a singular noun, to either be talking about Moshe or talking about the people. Because you can also, just like the word ha'am is a singular noun, it's referring to a lot of people. It means nation, but it's like a collective noun, meaning that even though it's a lot of people, but we deal with like it's just one. So you can have a verb also in the singular. So become ha'am, it should be, if it was plural, it'd be bekamu, right? But here it's become, right? So therefore the word can go with the people, which is fine, and that's the way we read it. But can also go Moshe Rabbeinu. So why don't we read it with Moshe Rabbeinu? There's Moshe Rabbeinu, you're going to die and lie with your fathers and get up. Well, right there you have the answer. Right? How do you do that? Right? If you're dead, you don't get up, unless of course we're talking about the Chis Mesi, the resurrection of the dead. Then everybody gets up, and that's not a Chiddush. There's nothing new about that. That applies to everybody, not just to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Gemara says we don't know if it's talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, that you will die and get up, or talking about the Jewish people, that they will arise, so to speak, and go after the ways of Canaan, just a figure of speech. So the Rizal says, actually, the truth is, and maybe it applies to the other 4 psukim as well, that it goes on both. And that's one of the reasons why the pasuk does that, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu did that. Part of the drush of this verse is that it can be used either way. It can be used for Moshe Rabbeinu, and it can be used for the people. In fact, used for both at the same time. How does that work? So really, Rizal explains that Hashem is saying to him that you will die, but you're going to get up, meaning you're going to reincarnate, not just resurrect later on like everybody else, but you're going to reincarnate, and every generation you're going to come back to fix up the generation, Moshe Benu, right? And this is going to go on all through history. So there's no generation, the Rizal says, that Moshe does not come back in some form. Will you recognize him as Moshe Benu? No. He might have a name David. He might be called Moshe, also, but a different Moshe, right? Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Moshe somebody else. And it's like, but his spark, maybe it will be divided amongst more than one rabbi. Because certainly if we had a Moshe Rabbeinu in this generation, we'd know about it. He'd stand out a lot. We would realize this person is not from this generation. So maybe his soul is divided up, because that can happen too. You can have one soul divided amongst different people at the same time, the same generation. And maybe this has a spark of Moshe. This is a spark of Moshe. Whatever he is, but whatever form he's in, he comes back. And every generation, specifically to rectify, but not just rectify the generation, but specifically to rectify the heir of Rav. Because he was the one responsible. The mixed multitude, the guy, the thorn in his side, our side, until the end of history, this very day, maybe even more so than ever before. Now, right? So he comes back because he was the one who insisted on taking them out of the desert. Out of Mitzrayim into the desert, right? So therefore he's responsible. So he comes back in every generation to fix him up. But, says the Arizal, not just him, but also the Dor Hadeya, the generation of knowledge, because that's what the generation of the desert, those Jews that left Mitzrayim with Moshe Ben into the desert, who didn't die in the plague of darkness, they're called Dor Hadeya, the generation of knowledge. They will come back too. That's the Kam Ha'am. The people will arise. Now, they'll also reincarnate, just like you reincarnated or will reincarnate. They're also going to reincarnate. And not just that, by the way, but the heir of Rav too. At the end of history, he says, in the final generation, he emphasizes Dor Basra, the final generation, everyone's going to come back for a curtain call. I mean, off the bat, that's telling you that even though thousands of years have passed between the time we left Mitzrayim, we got to this point, that it's not going to make a difference because it's the same souls. Whatever they've gone through in the meantime, they've gone through. But at the end of history, they're all going to come back, reprising Geulas Mitzrayim all over again, which fits beautifully, but he actually brings it down and says that's why the pasuk says that you're going to see wonders like you did on the way to Mitzrayim. Talk about the final redemption. And the final redemption, as the Gemara also talks about, you're going to see miracles like the ones you left when you leave. What do you have to add the words like leaving Mitzrayim? Just say, you'll see wonderful miracles, fantastic, mufsim and osos, so you're not going to believe what you're going to see. Why add the words like in the days of leaving Mitzrayim? Because it's all one history. It's all one thing. And so much has been accomplished in the meantime and has happened. So much history. Moshe Rabbeinu, he died. They closed the Chumash. When the Nevi'im stopped existing, and the prophecies, was no longer amongst the Jewish people, we stopped Navi, and then Kesuvim ended later on, by with other works. But at some point in time, we closed Tanakh. I think we canonized it. Right? We shut it down. And after that, it's just history. Now just recording history. And the Romans came along, and then later on, you had the Holy Roman Empire, and then you have, the Byzantine period, and you also have, remember history, you have all the different nations have formed since then. And Tanakh is like a thing of the past. Doesn't, yeah, fine. I believe Yitzis Mitzrayim. I talk about it twice a day on my Shema, if not more times, because it's such a part of history. But connected to it, that as if what I'm going through today, it's all about that. Yeah, well, it's all about that. You know why it's all about that? Because the theme has never changed. And the fact is, it's not even starting with Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the middle of the story. It goes back to Adam HaRishon. We spoke about this. Right? The centrality of the concept of das. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Adam HaRishon the responsibility to name all the animals, which he did. And it says whatever he named them, that's what they were. Well, what else? If he named them something, I'm going to call this an elephant. Therefore, it will be a monkey. No, it doesn't work that way. And those are English names anyhow. He had the Medrash is telling you that what he named it, that's what it was, meaning that he could look into the essence, not just look at the animal, but he understood the essence of the animal, what it was all about, what its main purpose was in creation, and give it a name that suited that. Meaning that God was saying he was accurate in his assessment of the animals, and therefore he had this capacity, this powerful capacity to look into things. I mean, it was unique. We don't have the same type of capacity today, a little bit, but not the same way. Some people are very insightful, they can see to people, but he was on a much higher level. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Adam HaRishon, fine, you've named all the animals, now what will you call yourself? And he called himself Adam. And he said, okay, nice name, right? People like that name in the future probably too, right? Easy to spell. Why? Why are you calling yourself Adam? So he says, because the word Adam is a composite of two parts, Aleph and Daled Mem. The Aleph, the first letter, and then the Daled Mem. What does it stand for? Well, the Aleph always alludes to Kodesh Baruch Hu. So therefore, it reminds me that I'm a composite of two parts. That I have a soul that came from Hashem, that's the Aleph, and the Daled Mem, right, reminds me how dumb I can actually be. Well, that's a different word, right? Blood. The word Daled Mem is blood. So that's the physical component. Blood represents the physical component of a person, of a human being. So he said, I have to keep those in balance. That's my job. My job is to be B'Tselem Elokim. I was made B'Tselem Elokim, to be an Adam Shalom, as the Real talks about, meaning that I have to balance up my body and my soul. And if that's an easy thing to do, I don't think so. Right? Mankind has struggled with this ever since the beginning. Ever since the beginning, from the very start. Right? Meaning what? They come out of Gan Eden, and Cain murders Hevel. One of the first acts done in history is Cain killing Hevel, murdering him. Over what? Because God paid attention to Hevel's sacrifice but it was your fault. What are you blaming your brother for? He did the right thing, you did the wrong thing, and you're killing him instead? Kill yourself. You're the one who should have brought the better sacrifice. That's the body over the soul. That's when someone has lost touch with their soul. There are people walking around today in this world who will argue, using their very soul, the breath that's inside of them, that they have, that is their neshama. Neshima is breath. Neshama is soul, right? The soul provides the breath. And using it to argue that they don't have a soul. You cannot believe how many people, brilliant people, bright people, who believe they don't have, because all they see is the body. And that's what the Greeks said. That's what the people of Noah's time said. It's a tough one. And that's Mitzrayim too. Mitzrayim was hedonistic, right? They had tons of gods, but they're all gods made in the image of man, not the other way around. So Adam was trying to head that off at the pass by giving him the name Adam, but no one really refers to himself that way anymore. That much, human beings, and we have a specific names. So, but that's supposed to remind you. That's why the very first plague in Mitzrayim was blood. Was blood of all the things, right? We know why the Nile was afflicted. We know why Moshe Rabbeinu brought a plague to the Nile, because Baruch Hu told him to do that, because they worshipped it as a god. So God says, when I go after a nation, I go after their gods too, and principally after their gods. So therefore, I'm going to smote, strike, whatever, damage the Nile River. Okay, so turn it to oil, dry it up, right? Make the water disappear. Why blood? Of all things, why blood? I mean, yeah, it's disgusting, but still, there's other things that are disgusting. Swamp is also disgusting. You're not going to drink swamp water, and the fish will die there too. So why blood specifically? Because the main point of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of course, was not about the Egyptians being destroyed. It was about the Jewish people being built up. It was about the recovery of Das. That's what it's all about. Mentality, perspective, a way of looking at things. It's this week someone saw some article somewhere about how I think in Lakewood it was either last week or this week, or I think it was last week, there was a meeting of Moses Gedolei Ador, big rabbanim from different yeshivas and communities, and to tackle the problem of AI, right, which usually stands for artificial intelligence, but also apparently it stands for artificial information, because it's been caught many times coming up with its own sources and passing them off as real sources, or taking information and making it appear as if that's what was actually said, but it in fact wasn't, to be very careful. But it's insidious, and it's having a very big effect in the world. And I'll tell you honestly, I thought the internet itself was a big problem, and it seemed like there couldn't be one any worse than that because of all the bad things that people were doing with it. But the truth is, it was mild compared to what AI is all about, because with AI, you could do all kinds. I mean, the sky's the limit when it comes to fantasy, when it comes to perpetrating evil. I mean, it empowers the koyach of these things to do good is absolutely amazing. absolutely wondrous. I mean, I'm constantly in awe of how much good you can do with technology. It really is fantastic. How many lives have been saved? How much information has been given over? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The problem is never that. The problem is those people who recognize an opportunity to use good for bad and ruin it for everybody else in the end. Because the damage they can do, it's a lot easier to do evil in the world than it is to do good. Because the Yetzer supports it, and people are vulnerable. There's naivety, and all these things combine to make people sitting ducks for other people's evil. But it doesn't compare to AI. And as I was reading about this and saying to myself, okay, I can hear that. I understand the importance of it. I've already seen some of the effects of it. So, but it's huge. It's huge. It's like so monster. How are you going to be able to cope with this and deal with this? What, smartphones are one thing. Smartphones, you can say to somebody, you know, you can't have them. And if you have them, we won't let you into our yeshiva, our cheder, right? We won't marry our children, whatever. You can control it to some degree, not completely, but you can control it to a large degree because it's very hard to have it and unless you hide it and walk around in a very secretive way. It's very hard to someone's going to find that at some point in time. But when it comes to AI, you can be affected by it in ways without even knowing it. You can decide you won't even have a computer in your house and you'll never ever use it and still be affected by it because somebody else who you're in contact with or a book that you happen to buy, that person did. The tons of examples how easily it can infiltrate how vulnerable we are to the effects of it, to the point that people are really worried about how, it can destroy the world. Not just because of, I mean, it was foretold going back to, 50s and 60s already. People talked about it theoretically. And here we are in the reality of it so quickly. It's amazing what mankind will do for the sake of advancing without, just throwing caution to the wind. But the more you think about it, the more you realize it really is perfectly framed in our generation. This is the generation that corresponds specifically to when Adam Arishon ate from the Eitz Das Tov Ra. We won't go through the whole cheshbon right now. There's lots of books that show you exactly what's going on, but we know 1,000 years corresponds to one day of creation. That's a rule. That's the way it goes. Whatever happens in history happens as it does, when it does, because something happened during the respective day of creation. That's the root. Just like you plant a seed and a plant grows, the plant is very different than the seed, but everything the plant is able to do comes from the seed itself. So therefore, if you divide 1,000 years by 24 hours, you can figure out 1 hour of creation is equal to, in the course of the millennium. But, says the Medrash and others as well, that you can't divide by 24 because since history is continuous from, let's say, 5,000 to 6,000, there's not the first 500 years are not like without events. It's the same, the first 500 years as the second 500 years. So therefore, the entire 1,000 years has to correspond to the hours that God was actually creating, which was only daylight hours. So therefore, as the Leshem explains, you have to divide by a factor of 12, which means that 83.33 years in the course of a millennium equals 1 hour of creation. And since the Gemara tells us which hour that Adam ate from the tree, right, we can now make a calculation to see what they would correspond to in the course of the sixth millennium, because he ate on the 6th day, so it has to be the sixth millennium. He ate in the 10th hour of the 6th day, the 10th daylight hour. So that therefore you divide by 12, and you get 83. You make out the cheshbon. It turns that as of 1990, 5750, which coincides perfectly with the last quarter of day 6, Erev Shabbos, which has specific halachas as well. There's so many things here. You cannot believe how many things actually line up. That's why it's so convincing. It's only not convincing if you don't do the work to see what it is. And some idea up in the air. Someone just said, of course, but no, but you got to see how literally things that really go back a long time. That put it this way: if you ask the odds makers in Las Vegas, what are the chances of this happening? The way the confluence of events and psukim and things happening like that so precisely, astronomical. It's God's world. He planned it. He wasn't taking a shot in the dark. Set up that way. If it's set up that way, then it's going to happen because, and he can control. We can't, as human beings, we can't control everything. So therefore, we can want things to occur a certain way, but they won't necessarily because of things we didn't take into account. But God does, and He makes every all. So therefore, yeah, it works out perfectly. And here we are. Here we are. As of 1990, it's now 2026, right? So we're literally, 36 years into the 10th hour. When Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we've had this discussion before. Nachash, Mashiach, same gematria as all. We don't have to do it all over again. But it's about das. That was about das. History's about das. It's all about das. What you think, how you think, where you get your information from, how you apply it, perspective, mentality. It's all the same thing. It's all part of the same idea. The true exile is not of people. That's the result. That's not the cause. That's the effect. That's the impact. The true exile is of das. Either das is in exile or das is in freedom. What is das in exile? Well, that's what we call das ra. It was an eighth of das tovara, a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So when the knowledge is corrupted, it's called exile. That is the idea of exile. The real hardcore definition of exile. That's what exiles people, their mentality. A person could be living physically enslaved, but with the proper mentality. I remember reading a Peledic story about Sharansky when he was still back in Russia and they were jailing him, right? And he was wearing a kippah, and they took it away from him. So he took his T-shirt, he ripped it up, and made a kippah and put it on his head, and they left it. Right? There's no question he was incarcerated and he suffered, and he would like to have not been there, but there was a level of freedom he had that some people don't have in everyday life because they're being told what to do by marketing and advertising and and trends and all that. And they're slaves to money, they're slaves to their job, and slaves to relationships, slaves because of mentality. That's why Egypt is called Mitzrayim. Where'd the term come from? Where the name Mitzrayim? It's a biblical name. Still on the maps in Hebrew, you'll see Mitzrayim because Mitzrayim is Egypt. Mitzrayim is not first and foremost Egypt. Egypt happened to be Mitzrayim at that time. But Mitzrayim is a conceptual reality. All Hebrew words are conceptual realities. Adam, right? Soul, body, right? Animals. Every name is the essence of something. You name it. Whatever the word is, you can find a conceptual basis for the name in Hebrew because all of the letters themselves are concepts. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, they all represent different ideas. So you're just combining ideas to make a word that describes a specific reality. It's always concept. It's a conceptual reality. The physical world we live in is just a three-dimensional, if it's even that, but it's a three-dimensional projection of two-dimensional ideas right there in the paper. In fact, the Gemara says, well, the Medrash actually says it, that when God decided to make Ma'aseh Bereshis, He looked into the Torah as a blueprint. I mean, every building starts off with a blueprint, a design. It's two-dimensional. They build models too, so you can get a better idea of it. But the actual design is on paper. It's flat. It's just a concept that's being developed and then being projected into the three-dimensional reality, which is what AI does also. I mean, here I am sitting here talking to you, right? I can see myself, right? And I look three-dimensional, but I'm not three-dimensional, not the screen. It's a bunch of little, lights going on and off, and based upon algorithms and various different things that, takes the information, breaks it down, brings it into data quite quickly, which is quite remarkable, but it's all two-dimensional, but the brain's reading is three-dimensional and living. And that's reality. Mitzrayim is called Mitzrayim because Kabbalistically, the word Mitzrayim is made up of two parts. The word Meitzer, which is boundary, to be bound by something, and the last part is Yud Mem. And Yud Mem is the gematria of 50. And 50 always, when you hear 50, the first thing that should come to your mind is the Nun Shari Bina, the 50 gates of understanding. the basis of all Torah, the basis. It's really the Nun Shari Bina, called gates because there's different portals, so to speak, of knowledge, just like holidays are different portals. But the whole concept of Nun Shari Bina is that the different ways that God filters His light down to us, that we can think like Him, because that's what it means to be free, to think like Him. The more you think like God, the freer you're going to be as a person. Your body will tell you otherwise, right? How many Bali Tshuva? I don't just mean people who were secular, but even people who were religious went away and came back. How many people have discovered the hard way how what they once thought was the most confining thing in the world? And people will tell you that once upon a time, I thought Shabbos was the most, confining and obstructing. How could you possibly enjoy yourself on a weekend when you can't even touch a light switch? You can't go to your favorite movie. How is it possible? How can you enjoy yourself? And yet they find out later on, oh, it turns out that pleasure is about something altogether different. That's the body talking. That was Yetzer Hara. That's Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is any place, and any person for that matter, but anything in the world that confines, that blocks, that constricts the Nun Shari Bina. And that's all Das. In fact, that's the basis of Das. I mean, Das just means knowledge. Right, but there's das with small d, or you can't say small dalet, but small d, and there's capital D das, and small letter das is really more like dea. It's just factual information, knowledge. Das is really wisdom. Eitz das tavara, eitz chayim. Eitz chayim was the das, was the eitz das with a capital D. In fact, the truth is, in the beginning, there wasn't even a tree of knowledge of good and evil. There's only a tree of knowledge of good. Because the light of Das, which the tree is based upon, was high enough up away from the world that evil couldn't reach it. So therefore it was uncorrupted. And it could not be used for evil in any way. Adam made a miscalculation to fix the world. One thing we all agree on was Lashem Shemayim. He's not simply taking a cookie for supper without permission. He was trying to rectify the world, but he assumed too much about himself. But it's all part of God's plan. It wasn't accidental. Otherwise, God would have said something. He let it happen because it's all meant to be. As Adam himself tells God in the Medrash, you mean to bring death into the world. I'm just the scapegoat. I'm the fall guy over here. Because history has to play itself out. Because that's the whole development of Das. So Mitzrayim was a counter-Das culture. The Jewish people represent the vehicle, the container for Das. That's what Torah is. That's why it's called Das Torah. And Shlomo Melech refers to it as Das Elokim, godly knowledge. That wisdom, that knowledge that lets you see God in creation and life, that gives you the proper priorities of what you should do with yourself and to participate and to understand what the most important. This just imagine how far we've come and gone away, right? Adam Arishon, he eats from the dust and he hides in the bushes. That's symbolic of what's going to happen to mankind throughout the history of mankind. We're just always hiding from God. Here we are. The world is like just marketing, advertising, and trends, and fashions, and food, and clothing, and entertainment, and secular education. You name, just boom. That's the whole world. And yet, the only priority, the only thing that matters, is knowing God. That's it. Nothing else counts. These things could help sometimes. I mean, even through mathematics, even through physics. Through science and medicine, you can come to see God, but it's very distracting. It's very hard when someone gets up who claims to be an atheist. I was listening to a presentation by a physicist. He's actually, I don't know if he's still living anymore, but brilliant man. I think he's even Jewish. I'll leave the name out for the time being, but we're talking about time, talking about space, different things, and incredible. Like, it's amazing what people come up with without ever seeing it in actual life, but they find these these experiments to measure things that it is absolutely awesome. There's no question about that. But in the course of his talk, and I think he was an atheist, if I'm not mistaken, right? But in the course of his talk, there were like at least 10, 15 times I could have put God into the sentence instead. And it would make perfect sense. And on the contrary, I got such chizuk. I got such, I was so inspired by what he said because it just showed me the wondrousness of what God is doing and how he does it and how sophisticated the system really is. I'm learning Kabbalah from, and I see the sophistication from one angle, but here, this, just in the physical world alone, the physics itself, is, how complex everything is and how brilliant and how deceiving also for that matter. Because a lot of his talk was talking about how we don't really talk about the truth. We actually live in a shell. We live with false notions of everyday realities and treat them like this when they're really like that instead. And it's all about us. That's what Mitzrayim was. What Parah was doing, it's brought and there's always hints to these things, and you just have to pay attention. But just again, we take things in a shot level. Oh, okay, it's an interesting idea, and we move on, as opposed to saying, wait a second, what does that even mean? And how does it reflect on what's actually going on? It says avodah befarach, right? Paro worked them avodah befarach, a very, very backbreaking, difficult work. And the Gemara darshans out what does befarach mean? So perach, so the Medrash says a soft mouth means he conned them into working before he finally enslaved them at the beginning. But the main thing it means that he made them have a perach. The Paro worked them so hard. Again, this is a deeper level understanding. One of the main goals that Paro had in working them so hard, and you can see this by the way, because if his whole goal was just to build something, you don't take away the materials and say, go build it. Obviously, they're not going to. You want to kill them, so kill them, but it's not going to happen. They're not going to build it. You want to build the building, you have to give them what they need. Clearly, Par was breaking them, and getting a building out of it was on the side. And how did he do that? So the Medrash says he made their mouths soft, meaning they were so tired at the end of the day, they could not speak in Torah. They didn't have the Torah yet, but whatever they did have was a tradition going back to Yaakov Avinu. They had something. The Levium were learning something. They had a base Medrash. Certainly learning something, Hilchas B'nai Noach, but they had a Masorah, and we know the Avos kept all the mitzvahs in Eretz Israel, so therefore they must have known about that, so they had what to learn, for sure. And they had Nevuah, and whatever, it's not so important. The main thing is that they were learning. And Paro understood as long as they remain connected to this learning, as long as they have these ideas and these thoughts, and that's why Moshe drove him nuts, because he said this, he's bringing it back. He's awakening within him. I did such a good job of crushing it, and now he's bringing it back. Not just the hope he provided, but the knowledge. Because Moshe he's the tzinor, he's the pipeline for the das. Moshe himself comes from the das. And one of the reasons why, because the das is a sphera. There's a place in the sphere called das, and that's where Moshe's souls come. And not just that, but the air of Rav also come from the same place, the same level as Moshe Rabbeinu, just corrupted. And that's why the Gra points out that the gematria of Erev is Das. So clearly they have to be back at the end of history. If it's going to be a war over Das, about Das, then they're one of the main, antagonists. And of course, the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu is called Doradeya, the generation of knowledge. And this kind of blew me away because in 1989, I remember, I wish I kept the article. I did keep the article at the beginning, but a lot of this happened since then. But I remember when the internet first was catching the eye, the attention of the world, and they began to write about it. Newsweek, I was back in Toronto at the time. Newsweek had an article, and the title was "Generation of Knowledge." And I thought, whoa, that's not the first time I've heard that before. That's a stolen line. Generation of knowledge. Why? Because it's a super information highway. And I thought that's got to be a remes. That's got to be a Kosh Baruch Hu talking to us about what's happening. Because really, until 1990, the fact that it was a world and history about Das, it wasn't so obvious. But after 1990, it's only been about knowledge. Only been about information. That's all it's about. And now with AI, which is like literally taking the idea of knowledge and information to a whole different level that we never even imagined, that might even destroy us to the point that some people are worried that the only reason why World War III will actually happen will be because of AI. Because it's so integrated into our security systems and our defense systems, And it doesn't have that human component to be able to say, maybe I shouldn't press that button, even though it looks like a threat and smells like a threat and tastes like a threat. Maybe, just maybe it's not worth, they don't have that. They're programmed, that's a threat, deal with it. Oh, too bad. It was a mistake, but too late. That misses on its way. And the speed at which things will happen, ready for this? That all of World War III, for the most part, could take place in 1 hour because of AI. Yeah. But the good news is that as much as the rest of the world is caught up with this and worried about it, and all their projections don't take into account God. They don't take into account the final, redemption or the prophecies and all that was spoken about in the past, and how it's leading to the ultimate revelation for Kosh Baruch Hu, part of the preparation for HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealing himself once and for all to the entire world so that everyone understands that he's king over the entire world. On that name, on that day, God will be one and his name will be one. It's all part of that. So I suspect it will never play out the way people think it will because they're doing it based upon the natural order of things. But it is certainly a major part of the preparation for the final showdown. And that final showdown, as much as it may involve military and computers and money and oil and countries and things like that, ultimately the whole discussion is one about dust. And that's why the Zohar makes its remarkable claim by saying that anybody, I mean, this is really, and Moshe Rabbeinu, by the way, according to the Rashbi, who some say was a Gilgal of Moshe Rabbeinu, right, that he told the Rashbi this idea, that through the Zohar, the Jewish people will leave exile in mercy by learning the Zohar. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of learning these deeper ideas, and but I understand that not everybody can. It's very frustrating. It's kind of a closed book for many people. And where do you start? So I understand it like this. That basically it means that we have to develop that dust. Whatever the Zohar comes to teach us, it comes to show us a world above and beyond the everyday world in which we live that Amalek pulls us down into. Don't forget, Amalek reached in to the cloud and pulled Jews out to get them, but they weren't the real, main, the main part of the nation. They were the stragglers, the ones who suffered bad dust. They didn't quite get on the same page as God, so they were vulnerable to the attacks of Amalek, and that's exactly where we are today. So you have to really take the time. I'm now quickly more than ever, right? And ask yourself, what do I think? And where did I get that from? How strong is my das? And what should my das even be? What should be my priorities? What should I be thinking about? What should I be learning? How should I look at the world around me? How much should I get into this world? How much is distracting me away from what counts the most in life? These are all the questions that Kosh Baruch Hu wants us to ask. Because ultimately speaking, that's the division point. When he decides who stays and who doesn't, who lives and who doesn't, who deserves the final redemption and who will be excluded from it, will come down to a person's das, based upon what they're capable of achieving and what they actually achieved in the end. As we go through these parashiyot, right, from starting with Shmos, this is Shovavim, which is all about the same idea. Right? As we go through these parashiyot, you have to pay attention from that point of view. This is Moshe Rabbeinu arguing with Paro over the future of the Jewish people. But it's not about physical slavery, clearly, because the Kosh Baruch Hu could take them in 2 seconds. Because Baruch Hu wanted to free the Jewish people, one plague, that's it. So then why is it? It takes 10 plagues. Why to go this whole process to Har Sinai and fight Amalek along the way as well? Because das is not something you get in a moment. I mean, you can, by the way, if Hashem decides to give it to you. But even if you get it, it's like winning, in a sense, interesting enough, it's like winning the lottery. Right? If you weren't a multimillionaire before, and you win the lottery, especially hundreds of millions of dollars, it sounds like, wow, this is the ideal. You can now buy whatever you want. It takes preparation. They have studies that show how many people have won the lottery have killed themselves or have miserable lives. It wasn't all sunshine. I'm sure some people managed it, but a lot of people not nearly as many as you think should. Why? Because being rich is a process. It's not a thing that's good to happen overnight, which is why a lot of children who inherit the wealth of their parents often destroy it as well, because you have to develop yourself the kind of person who can live with that type of money. Same thing is true of das, which is maybe why Shlomo Melech said, if you pursue it like silver and like buried treasures, das Elokim you will find, Yerushalayim you will find. So I always thought that meant that if you pursue it, meaning that you know how much you like silver, like Torah too. The way you do it, see how hard you work to make a living and make a lot of money. Do that for Torah instead, and then you will find das Elokim. But I think we can add to that definition another idea as well. The same way it takes time to accumulate money, to be able to use it properly and have the proper respect for it, that it works for you and you don't work for it. Instead, it takes time. You have to put the time in. It's buried treasures. You don't just walk at your front door and find one. If you do, let me know. But it's not doesn't no. You have to get a map. You should go someplace far away, dig up the ground, and maybe you will, maybe you won't. But it takes time, takes effort. Same thing. Because Baruch is telling you, don't expect to get das on a dime. It's not going to happen like that. You won't even recognize it when it comes along because you're not prepared for it. You start slowly, build step by step. And the good news is, as it says in Pirkei Avos, it's not for you to complete the task, but you're not free to abandon it as well. And that means, and if also from Zaragris says the same idea, according to his reward, it means that if a Baruch Hu sees you working in that direction, it counts for a lot more than you might have accomplished. Because two people can be on the exact same rung as a spiritual ladder when they die. But one person's feet are pointing upwards and one person's feet are pointing downwards. They will not go to the same place in the world to come. Even if they died at the exact same level. But one was on the way out, one was on the way up. It makes a big difference. Kosh Baruch Hu sees us working to get the proper das, to leave the Mitzrayim of our generation, and that could be an extremely important redeeming factor, especially at this late stage of history. Good Shabbos.